Hello, and welcome to an overview of DCNR's mini-grant program. In this presentation, we'll talk about DCNR's goals for the mini-grant program, the administrative process for running a mini-grant program, the general timeline for that administrative process, what reporting requirements there are, and some tips and best practices to help you manage your mini-grant program. Before we begin, let's review two key terms that will be important in this presentation. The first is grantee. For this presentation, a grantee is the organization that receives funds from DCNR to develop and administer a mini-grant program. The mini-grantee is the organization that in turn receives funding from a mini-grant program that is run by a grantee. You can think about the hierarchy like this. DCNR provides funding to a grantee to run a mini-grant program. The grantee in turn provides funding to mini-grantees to complete projects. This presentation is intended for grantees. Others may benefit from it, but we'll be assuming that those watching are or want to become grantees. Why does DCNR have a mini-grant program? One goal of the mini-grant program is to empower grassroots organizations. Larger groups can apply for mini-grants, but consider in your outreach how you can connect with smaller partners and more diverse organizations. Another goal of the program is to support small projects. The maximum mini-grant award for any project is $25,000, and projects should have a 12-month completion timeframe. If a project needs more time or money than those limits, it should pursue funding directly through DCNR's Community Conservation Partnerships Program, or C2P2, not through multiple rounds of mini-grants. What types of projects can mini-grants fund? Mini-grants are intentionally flexible, so they can fund a wide range of recreation and conservation projects. Some examples include plans, studies, educational materials, and special events. Development projects, like the construction of a trail or park facility, are also eligible, but keep in mind the cost and time limits from the last slide. These projects may be better fits for C2P2 if they're larger or will need more than a year to complete. As the grantee, you have flexibility to design your mini-grant program to accept a wide or narrow range of project types. Some grantees keep their mini-grants tightly focused to advance an organizational priority. Others fund a broad range of projects to accommodate local needs. Regardless of project type, all mini-grant projects should align with DCNR's mission, which is to conserve and sustain Pennsylvania's natural resources for present and future generations' use and enjoyment. Documents such as Pennsylvania's statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plan can help you identify state priorities. Since mini-grants are so flexible, it may be more helpful to think about what they can't fund. First, DCNR discourages organizations from repeatedly applying for mini-grant funding to support the same project or activities. Again, if a project will take longer than 12 months, the organization should consider applying for a C2P2 grant directly rather than applying through a mini-grant program. Second, mini-grants cannot fund land acquisition. If an organization wants to pursue a land acquisition project, that organization should consider applying through C2P2's land acquisition grants, not through mini-grants. If you have questions regarding the eligibility of a specific funding request, please contact your DCNR project manager. Next, let's talk about how to administer your mini-grant program. The most important thing to remember when you're administering a mini-grant program is to use your DCNR Grants Portal checklist. The checklist in the Grants Customer Service Portal is incredibly valuable. It walks you through every document that DCNR needs, as well as what those documents need to have in them. Keeping up with your project checklist is a great way to stay on top of your grant and make sure you're giving DCNR the opportunity to review documents that it needs to sign off on before you announce mini-grant funding or awards. For example, on this page, we can see different checklist items, as well as the pieces of information needed in each of those documents. A competitive application is required for all mini-grant programs. You'll need to submit a draft of your application and your mini-grant program guidelines to your DCNR project manager for review and approval. DCNR must approve both these documents before you announce that you have funding available for mini-grants. Who can apply to you for mini-grant funding? Mini-grant eligibility is dictated by the funding source of your overall grant. Most mini-grant programs are funded through the Keystone Fund or the Environmental Stewardship Fund. The legislation that created these funds specifies who is eligible. The Keystone Fund is more restrictive. It is limited to municipal entities. These include municipalities, counties, and municipal agencies, such as councils of government. The Environmental Stewardship Fund is more flexible. Municipal entities are eligible here as well, but educational institutions and nonprofits are also usually eligible. For nonprofits, they need to be a 501c3, and they must also be registered with the Pennsylvania Bureau of Charitable Organizations. Even if the nonprofit is small enough that it doesn't have to register according to BCO, the ESF legislation requires that the organization be registered. Mini-grantees need to provide dollar-for-dollar match for their projects. If they receive $5,000 in mini-grant funding, they need to show $5,000 in match. Both cash and non-cash match are acceptable, and there's no required ratio of cash or non-cash. That said, cash match shows organizational commitment to the project, so it's worth considering match types when you're evaluating applications. Also be aware that DCNR staff time and funding are not eligible as match. You'll need to set up a review committee to score applications when they come in. Your committee must include a representative of your organization, as well as a DCNR Bureau of Recreation and Conservation Regional Advisor. Beyond these two, the committee can be flexible and include however many members at large you need. That said, no committee member may have a conflict of interest with any applicant that is submitting for mini-grants. You'll need to provide DCNR a list of all committee members and a testament that none of them had a conflict of interest. Once applications come in, you'll need to score and select them. That means you'll need to develop score-based ranking criteria, which you'll need to submit to and have approved by DCNR. After you've scored and selected applications, you'll generate a final list of mini-grantees and submit it to DCNR. DCNR must approve this list before you make any award announcements. The award list has specific requirements about the information that needs to be on it. For those details, see your project checklist. When DCNR gives you the go-ahead to announce your awards, the next step is contracting. You'll need to create a template mini-grant contract that must be submitted to and approved by DCNR before you sign any contracts. The contract can be flexible to meet your needs, but DCNR does have some requirements. The contract must clearly identify the DCNR funding source. It must also acknowledge that all DCNR grant terms and conditions apply to the mini-grantee. Finally, it must include a copy of the non-discrimination sexual harassment clause from your original DCNR grant agreement. Once your template mini-grant contract is approved, you can contract with your mini-grantees. You'll need to submit fully executed copies of all your mini-grant contracts to DCNR to include in your grant project file. You can submit these fully executed copies anytime up to closeout of your overall project. Speaking of closeout, let's look at how you close out a mini-grant. For development mini-grant projects, those where there's construction going on, you'll need to conduct a final site inspection to make sure the project was completed according to the scope of work. Development mini-grant projects also need to have a DCNR funding acknowledgement sign installed. For all mini-grant projects, regardless of type, the mini-grantee must provide you a final cost spreadsheet that details the costs involved in the project. These costs must include not only the costs from the grant, but also the costs from the match. For this purpose, you should use DCNR's final cost spreadsheet. It's a good way of making sure that your mini-grantees are documenting all the project cost types in a way that fits DCNR requirements. You should also get copies or evidence of any final products produced by the mini-grant, for example, a report or study, depending on the type of project. You'll also need to get an account of the project. DCNR has a success story template that works well for this purpose. Let's review the mini-grant administrative process one more time using a timeline. We'll break the timeline into two parts. The first part is up through the announcement of mini-grant awards, and the second half is through closeout of your overall DCNR grant. The timeline begins when you receive approval to proceed from DCNR for your overall grant project. You should not begin any project activities until you have received this from DCNR. Once you have approval to proceed, your first step is to develop your draft application and guidelines, which you'll need to submit to DCNR for approval. After you have that approval, you can announce the availability of funding and open your grant round. While the grant round is open, form your review committee and establish your scoring criteria. Remember that you'll need to submit this information to DCNR for approval. When your round closes, score your projects. You'll then develop your final list of awardees, which you'll submit to DCNR for approval. Once you have DCNR approval, you can announce your awards. After you announce your awards, you'll need a template contract, which you'll have to submit to DCNR for review and approval. Once DCNR has approved your template, you can contract with your mini-grantees. Mini-grantees cannot start work until they have signed the contract. Remember that these are supposed to be 12-month maximum projects, so that's all the time you should be giving them to finish their projects. When the mini-grantee finishes their project, they can close out the project. That's when reporting and final payments happen. After all your mini-grants have closed and all your other scope of work items in your project have been completed, you can close out your overall grant. Submit all required documents to DCNR for project closeout. Next, let's talk about reporting requirements. What documentation is needed and who needs to hold on to it? We'll start with DCNR. We've covered the required documents for DCNR throughout this presentation. They include your draft mini-grant application and guidelines, the list of review committee members and conflict of interest verification, your scoring criteria, a list of all mini-grant awardees, a draft template mini-grant contract, copies of all executed mini-grant contracts, copies of any mini-grant final products, and success stories for each mini-grant. For you, the grantee, you'll need everything you've provided to DCNR, plus some additional documentation. You should retain all your mini-grant applications, all your score sheets, the final list of ranked scores for all applications, any final site inspection photos, and detailed financial records. For this last one, usually the final cost spreadsheet each mini-grantee provides you will be enough. But you should review the partnership's eligible-ineligible cost policy for more information on what documents you may need for specific cost types. Typically, you will not need copies of canceled checks or invoices, but know that you can request that information if you need it. Finally, the mini-grantee will also need to retain some documents. They'll need to keep copies of all paid invoices, copies of all canceled checks, records of their staff's billable rates and hours, records of any non-cash match, such as tracking volunteer hours and the value of any donated materials, and finally, documentation of any procurement processes they went through for the project. This mainly affects larger projects that need to get quotes or bids. Regardless of which organization holds the document, all records should be kept at least 3 years from date of final payment of the overall project. Note, this is the date of final payment for the overall project, not the close date for a particular mini-grant. So mini-grantees may need to hold on to records for more than 3 years, depending on when they finish their project. Finally, let's close with some miscellaneous tips and best practices to help you administer your mini-grant program. Remember that once you and the mini-grantee have signed the contract, you can pay up to 90% of the mini-grant funds to help them get going. However, you'll need to hold the final 10% of the mini-grant until the project is complete. If the project involves development, in other words, construction, that typically requires the mini-grantee to own or control the site. A landowner agreement may be used to meet this requirement, but confirm the language of any agreement with your DCNR project manager first. For competitive bidding in mini-grants, projects are usually small enough that you can follow the requirements of your organization, the grantee organization. That said, DCNR's competitive bidding policy does apply. Be sure to read it. Its requirements may come into play for certain projects, especially those with municipal applicants or larger budgets. Also, we know that things happen with mini-grants. Sometimes projects fall through, or they may come in under budget. If you have unspent mini-grant funds, they can be repurposed to other parts of your grant scope of work. However, you need DCNR project manager approval first before this repurposing can happen. Last up, here are a few best practices we've seen from mini-grant program managers. These aren't requirements, but they may help you administer and promote your mini-grant program. First, although you can build your own final cost form for mini-grantees to fill out, using DCNR's final cost spreadsheet will save you time and simplify your grant administration. The spreadsheet separates costs by category, and it has columns for key information, such as check numbers, that will help with reporting and verification in case of an audit. Similarly, you can use a different success story template, but using DCNRs will keep reporting consistent and ensure you get essential information from each mini-grantee. For smaller mini-grantees, your funding may be the first grant they've ever received. They may not be familiar with project management. Holding a webinar for your mini-grantees can be a good way of getting them all on the same page with expectations, reporting, and required documents. Last, mini-grants may be small, but they have real on-the-ground impacts. Show off that value by creating an online presence to highlight your past mini-grants. A web map is a useful tool to do this. Here's an example web map of the Pocono Forests and Waters Conservation Landscapes mini-grant program. Grants are divided by category. Users can quickly see projects in their area, then click on them for more information and links to project success stories. Web maps like this one typically require little, if any, coding experience, and they can be effective ways of demonstrating the value of your program to funders and applicants alike. Finally, when in doubt, contact your DCNR project manager. We can answer questions and provide advice on documents and any other issues that come up related to your mini-grant program. We're here for you, and we're happy to help. Thank you very much for watching this overview of DCNR's mini grant program.